Everybody just some time to arrive and be admitted to the event. So we'll just start in a few minutes. So please be patient. We're about to start. Okay. So I think we're going to get started now. I wanted to thank everybody for attending today's meeting. I wanted to remind everybody before we get started that this event is being recorded. I also wanted to remind everyone that after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation between Steven Dudley, our guest, and I, we will be taking questions from the audience, and the place to post those questions is in the chat box. I will look at the chat box and filter out the questions, trying to organize them as best I can into a set of coherent questions to continue the dialogue. Before that, Steven and I are going to engage in a conversation about his newly published book. So without further ado, let's get started. So we are lucky here today at the Mark School to have Steven Dudley with us. Steven Dudley has recently published a new and very insightful book entitled MS-13, the Making of America's Most Notorious Gang, which won a J. Anthony Lucas Award from the Columbia School of Journalism last year. Steven Dudley is the co-director and co-founder of Insight Crime, a large and very comprehensive website that follows in some detail criminal activities in the Americas. Dudley is a senior fellow at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies in Washington, D.C. He is the former bureau chief of the Miami Herald in the Andean region and the author of Walking Ghosts, Murdering Guerrilla Politics in Colombia, published by Routledge in 2004. Dudley has also reported from Haiti, Brazil, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Miami for National Public Radio and the Washington Post, among others. Steven has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Latin American history from Cornell University and a Master of Arts degree in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. He was awarded a Knight Fellowship at Stanford University in 2007 and is a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. In 2012 and 2013, he was a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to be discussing his work on MS-13 and drawing on Insight Crime's own description of MS-13. The Mara Salvatrucha, which is the full name of the organization, is perhaps the most notorious street gang in the Western Hemisphere. While it has its origins in the poor, refugee-laden neighborhoods of 1980s Los Angeles, the gang's reach now spans from Central America to Europe. While they are largely a predatory criminal organization, living mostly from extortion, say, as opposed to drug trafficking, the gang's resilience owes to its strong social bonds, which are created and strengthened in the acts of violence against mostly their rivals and one another. Their activities have helped make the Northern Triangle one of the most violent regions in the world. Honduras has a homicide rate of 41 per 100,000, Guatemala 21 per 100,000, El Salvador 36 per 100,000. In October 2002, the U.S. Department of the Treasury labeled the group a transnational criminal organization, the first such designation of a U.S. street gang, but their criminal proceeds do not even approach those of their counterparts on the Treasury Department's list. Welcome, Steven. And I wanted to start out our conversation by asking you, what were the most important findings in your new book?
Thank you, Professor Arias, and thank you very much to Baruch College for having me today. This is a great chance to talk about this, and especially with yourself, Professor Arias, with so much knowledge and background in this subject matter. So this is a great honor for me. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't start with kind of what people know from what they see in the news most recently, which is they see massacres of multiple people in various parts of the United States. They hear about this violence in the Northern Triangle. They see these images of young kids in orange jumpsuits being brought in and to courtrooms and talk about machetes and presidents, both North and South, talking about animals and comparing them to Al Qaeda and all of that stuff. That's sort of at the very superficial level, kind of our understanding, general understanding of this gang. And so we have this, kind of huge, maybe outsized notion of what this gang is and what it's capable of. And even when you read that description of it, it sounds horrible, and it is horrible in many respects, responsible for thousands of murders across the region every year. So there is something there, of course, but what it has ended up being, especially in the United States over the last few years, has been kind of this political football. So a lot of what this book was trying to do was to get at the human part of the gang that we don't hear about at all. We hear about all of these other stuff, and we hear about the law enforcement response to these other things, but we don't hear about the actual gang members themselves. And over a 10-year period, of studying the gang, I got to know a number of these particular gang members themselves. And I would say that I maybe knew that I had a book when I met one who I call Norman in the book. And Norman was, to me, representative of the larger gang story. I met him while he was, and this may surprise some people listening to this, he was actually a leader in the gang for 30 years, and he was fleeing the gang. He was trying to escape the gang's clutches. From El Salvador, he was fleeing to the United States. So I met him inside of a detention center in the United States, and he was pleading for what's called the relief from deportation, because he said that either the gang would kill him back in El Salvador or the authorities would kill him back in El Salvador. So we began to unravel his story, and his story is a story about not just him, but an entire family. His entire family sort of embodies this larger story that the gang helps us, tell, which is, kind of half of his family ends up in the gang, and half of his family does not end up in the gang. The family itself is sort of torn asunder by civil war dating back to the 1980s, in which, a very strong insurgency in El Salvador was trying to overthrow the government, and the United States-backed government was committing widespread human rights violations in that country and leading to displacement and the refugee crisis, which led to 1.5 million Salvadorans fleeing the country during that time period, landing in Los Angeles, and really providing the origins of the MS-13 in Los Angeles. So it was, kind of a way to tell that story. And that's where a couple of his brothers joined the gang. He ends up joining the gang in El Salvador. But the other part of his family is doing what most Salvadoran families do. They're struggling to survive this really binational existence, part of the family in the United States, part of the family in El Salvador, small bits and pieces of money going back and forth, parts of their family getting deported back, parts going back up to the US, some parts not being deported, but voluntarily going up to the US and then voluntarily leaving the US. And it was all these kind of machinations and complications, in addition to sort of Norman's own personal story, which made me think he was more representative of the whole. And that was the sort of human story, or in this case, the family story. A story which includes a lot of the commonalities that we find in a lot of the human stories of gangs, which have to do with abuse inside the home, violence that's happening outside of the home, and a general sort of, a sort of a disintegration of the family unit. And what replaces that family unit? Very often gangs. So on the first sort of superficial level of the book makes an argument that this is a human story. This is a family story. This is a story that is about economic, social, and political conditions, more than this is a story about a criminal gang. And I think that's very important, because perhaps my main argument built into that is that we need to think of the gang as a social organism first and as a criminal organism second. And I think that order is important and explains a lot about some of the stuff that Professor Arias alluded to, that they are not a international drug trafficking organization, because that's not their main purpose. So that's kind of at the very surface of the book. It is a social organism first, and it's a criminal organism second. At the second level of the book is a back and forth between an organization that is maturing, and that is sort of, evolving, and a public response that is evolving in response to the evolution of this particular organization, or vice versa. This goes back and forth. This is kind of a dialectic between these two forces that are bouncing each other's power off each other, and that they are each evolving and responding in different ways. The gang is evolving in a part because it exists and is formed in a very competitive environment, in a dense urban space in Los Angeles, where there are lots of other immigrant groups. So resources are scarce, jobs are scarce, access to, all the public sort of, goods and services that we think of as a given are scarce, because a lot of them are, undocumented. And they are living in a space where there's lots of gangs and lots of violence. So this kind of accelerates what the MS-13 begins as in LA, which was a group that loved heavy metal music, if you can believe it. So they gather around like many community groups do, and they loved heavy metal music and they listened to heavy metal music, but they quickly evolve in this very competitive and violent environment. The response to that is where we start to get to kind of the original sins of public policy as it relates to gangs. They include creation of special police forces that are really kind of, knock down the door and drag everybody away type responses. Not very what we think of as sort of intelligence policing or intelligence-based policing responses. Very much a hammer approach. And literally started, and this really began in the response to the gangs in places like LA. Literally, the response was militaristic. We see that all over police forces in the United States today. But at that time in the 1980s, when the MS-13 was emerging, this was novel. This became the norm, as you guys know, and you can look around your own police forces now, but this was not the norm back then. So that was one of the responses. Among the other responses were to create things that we think of as commonplace now, things like gang injunctions. So the congregation of various people who fit certain types of profiles that we developed, and we now have names for these, and you really can't do these. But all those things that you associate with things like stop and frisk, and racial profiling and things of that sort, those were codified to a certain extent in the California response to gangs. And they too were also exported out to places in the United States. And then there were, other things that went back and forth with that, but that led to the sort of next evolution of the gang, which was they began to become mass incarcerated. They were incarcerated with a lot of other people when the United States was going through its period of mass incarceration, and they evolved. They evolved because they had gotten contact with other criminal organizations, and they became more sophisticated. They became more mature. They became part of structures that were different. And then when they were released from prison, the other subsequent policy decision was to deport them in mass. And when they deported all these ex-convicts in mass, many of whom were gang members, they deported the gang sort of brand names, the big gang brand names, down to places like Central America, which did not have the ability to fight off gangs in the way that the United States did. They didn't have necessarily the option to incarcerate or seemingly incarcerate their way out of the problem like the United States had tried to do. And those big brand names established themselves in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras principally. But that was in part because of this deportation process. That was a policy decision that the United States government makes. So you can see how these things begin to bounce off of each other over the course of the evolution of the gangs. And that's the sort of second level of the book. And the argument as it relates to that level is really that rather than dealing with the gang problem itself, what this does is it accelerates and spreads out the gang problem. Because we don't, and this goes back to the first argument, because we don't think of this as a social problem, we think of this as a criminal problem and deal with it only as a criminal problem, then our subsequent law enforcement responses just exacerbate that problem. They don't deal with the underlying causes of that problem. And therefore the problem spreads, which is exactly what we've had. The third part of the book, maybe we consider this kind of on the meta level, is this very complex and unequal relationship that exists between the United States and countries like El Salvador, and how that unequal relationship also lays down, in essence, really is the cause, or the underlying causes are laid down for the gang by that unequal relationship. This relationship is, on the one hand, a dependency of sorts on the part of the Salvadorans. They very much depend on the United States for a lot of things. The United States buys the bulk of their, major commodities and raw materials. The United States is home to about 1/5 of all Salvadorans born on this planet, a larger percentage than any other country in the world that lives in the United States. They send back then via remittances about 20% of the country's GDP from the United States. So there's a clear dependency on those two. And of course, it's that human escape valve for labor. There's an excess amount of labor in El Salvador, and they're going to the United States. So there's a lot of ways in which there's a dependency there on the part of the Salvadorans. And on the part of the US, it is really a relationship of abuse. The United States abuses El Salvador. Abuses El Salvador for what? Well, it's very cheap commodities. It's very cheap and sort of never-ending supply of labor, and its willingness to kind of fight the proxy wars that come along with our very unequal system that we have developed. An unequal system that is, economic and political, and increasingly in its manifestations in the United States, is incredibly unequal in terms of the concentration of wealth in very, very few hands versus the rest of the society. This is on for the marginalized communities, the type that were going back to the 1980s, that were the refugees that came to the United States. This, of course, has existed for decades and is what lays the sort of basic groundwork for discontent, and really in some arguments, and there is an argument to be made for this, really is what lays the groundwork inevitably for gangs. Gangs are, for some academics, they are kind of a sort of disorganized rebellion of sorts. So think of it as kind of a manifestation of all our failures. When we look in the mirror and see our flaws, what we are seeing are gang members. And this is the other part of the book. The book is the back and forth and the relationship, this very unequal relationship between these two countries. Not only do we export the ex-convicts back there and therefore de facto export these large gang structures back there, or at least they're sort of, their models back there, and then they establish themselves. But then we also export our poor public policies back there, which also include, going back to the second point, these policies of using a hammer every time we think we see a nail. In this case, using what they call mano dura, or hardline policies in order to deal with gangs. We take that model and we export it back to places like El Salvador, where it has an even worse effect and sort of rebound effect, because when there are mass incarcerations inside Salvadoran prisons, they're not nearly as equipped to deal with the repercussions that causes. And now we have basically the gangs operating from prison in places like El Salvador. And literally their entire leadership is operational and runs the gangs from the prisons themselves, because the states are incapable of dealing with the consequences of having these massive numbers of gang members inside their own prison systems. So, you can see how these three things are intertwined, but those are the three basic levels of the book. This sort of very personal, human, and almost family story, which tells the story of gangs as kind of a social group or a social organism, or even a community of sorts. They have a name for that. They call it el barrio, right? It's this kind of mythic notion of living in this sort of protective gang cocoon. That's the idea of el barrio. And I know el barrio literally means community, but in their case, they use it interchangeably with the word gang. I mean, for them to talk about el barrio is to talk about themselves, to talk about their situation. That is not to say or to minimize at all what they do. And they also have a very clear understanding of their kind of split personality, which is a euphemism for the devil, because they realize that that's also a core essence of what they are. So they're kind of, they understand that they are victims, and they understand that they are also victimizers at the same time. So a lot of that human story is about this sort of dual personality that they have. And then the second level, of course, is this back and forth between public policy and the evolution of the gang itself. And the gang does evolve. The gang does stretch its legs on a criminal level. The gang does become increasingly more violent, as we referenced at the beginning. And then the third level is this very complex relationship between the United States and places like El Salvador. El Salvador, for me, is kind of a way to tell a larger story about how the United States deals with countries like El Salvador. I'll leave it there.
So you covered a lot of ground in that answer. I wanted to talk a little bit more, especially because we're here, in New York and you're living in DC, about the different structures of the gang and the different ways it operates. One in Los Angeles, right, the site of its origin. Two in Central America, but three, I wanted to make sure which you've talked about a bit, but I think we could maybe develop a little more. And three, I want to make sure we don't leave out the structure and the operations of the gang in places like Long Island and the DC suburbs.
The way that the gang evolved initially, and has evolved since, was to create these things they call cliques. These are the cells, the basic units of the gang itself. And the original cliques are based around physical territory. So they're named after streets, or named after areas they hung out in. They're one of the original cliques of the MS-13 was called the 7-Eleven, because they hung out near a 7-Eleven in the center of LA. And others were named for, major thoroughfares, Normandy or Hollywood, or areas, inside of LA. This model, evolved over time, where you had, pieces of these particular gangs could migrate to other places. So you had, like a Hollywood clique, which would go to Houston, or parts of the Hollywood clique would go to Houston, and then it would start a Hollywood clique in Houston, even though there is no Hollywood in Houston, or it would go to the East Coast, or in some cases go back to Central America and start the sort of Hollywood clique there. And so you could begin to see little pieces of cliques becoming international. As they got more and more cliques, I mean, literally hundreds of cliques, they tried to sort of reorganize themselves in another way, which was create what they called programs, which would have cliques underneath the programs. So you have, a program might have 50 cliques underneath it, and you would have, there's an East Coast program, there's a Hollywood program, and they all have a number of other individual cliques underneath them. And then above them, you have what are called, they've been called different things, but probably the most common name now is what's called a ramfla, which is a wheel, which is a sort of board of directors. These boards of directors really operate in their own spaces. So you'll have a ramfla, or board of directors, in El Salvador. You'll have another one that's operational out of Honduras. You'll have another one in Guatemala. You'll have another one in Los Angeles. So, you can see where this is going. It's a really disparate, decentralized organization in that regard. It doesn't have it has a strict hierarchy within the cliques themselves, but it doesn't necessarily have a strict hierarchy underneath sort of one gang board of directors. That doesn't exist. That's a bit of a myth, like this idea that the MS-13 has one single board of directors, one single Ramfla that is moving around its members like chess pieces. That is not how it works. In fact, there's a lot of dissension within them, a lot of infighting within them. And what you really have are kind of gangs within a gang. I mean, the most powerful and influential cliques like Hollywood are really kind of gangs within a gang. And they operate differently also depending upon where they are. In some areas, they're very sophisticated. Well, sophisticated in the sense that we think of sophisticated. They might be interacting with, politicians. They might be, buying up restaurants or usurping, bus company. That would be quite a sophisticated criminal operation for a gang that mostly depends on extortion. And most of the rest of the gang, while you do have sort of parts of it that might be getting involved in sophisticated criminal activities like this is a teeny percentage of them. Most of them operate in a very rudimentary level. And that rudimentary level is kind of based on their extortion that they can get from their areas under their control, from literally their physical areas where they have operational presence, great numbers of them. And this is where the gang really draws a lot of strength, is that there is a seemingly endless number of possible recruits. And I would argue those recruits, that sort of endless supply of recruits, is because we don't address the underlying causes of the gang. So in a way, our own failures on a policy level, are kind of also feeding into this sort of never-ending, structure here. It's been around for 40 years. It doesn't show any signs of going anywhere anytime fast. So that's the basic structure of this. I hope that more or less gives you a picture.
Yeah, well, and just briefly, I wanted to follow up. As compared to what the MS-13 cliques and programs do in the West and in Central America, what do the cliques in the New York and Washington area spend most of their time doing?
These are much smaller organizations in the United States than they are in Central America. The cliques in the US in a space like Long Island will be anywhere from 10 to 15 guys. They're all men. They don't allow women into their ranks anymore. And in a place like El Salvador, you can have cliques that have 50 to 70 members. So just on that alone is a very different operational structure. The ones in the US, very often, they're going to school, they have jobs. It is not a full-time operation at all. It's very much a part-time operation and goes in waves. It tends to sort of, their activities go in waves, and they can be very active for a time and then become what they call calmado, or sort of semi-retired. And then they can be called up again, and then they can be calmado again. This is also related to the power of the state in these particular spaces. The government of the United States is much more effective at getting information, sussing out what's happening, and prosecuting them. And so this is why you also have these kind of waves of activity. Then they're suppressed by law enforcement activities. You have a lot of roundups, a lot of cases. Then there's a couple-year lull in a place like Long Island, for instance, and then boom, it pops up again, and then they get suppressed, then pops up again. This is why it sort of goes like this in terms of activity. And most of those cases, by the way, are not sophisticated criminal operations that they're prosecuting them for. They're prosecuted for assault and murder more often than not. They're not prosecuted like we're thinking of, these sort of very sophisticated drug trafficking operations, because that's not what they have. That's not what their criminal economy is based on. By the way, very rudimentary criminal economy in the United States, which is mostly sort of extortion of small informal businesses or small formal businesses. At its most sort of sophisticated level in Los Angeles, you will have them collecting money from, unlicensed gambling or prostitution houses, and some drug peddling. So these are very rudimentary criminal schemes. The more sophisticated criminal schemes tend to happen in very small circles in places like California. Maybe some instances we're starting to see, perhaps budding attempts to do some international drug trafficking in places like Atlanta or on the East Coast, but very budding, very in their infancy, and they fail. I think the pattern we see is that they're small. They try and work with outside organizations to move drugs, and they fail. And this is what we see over and over. And 40 years to be a drug trafficking organization, and they haven't yet, an international drug trafficking organization, and they haven't reached that status. So I think we need to ask ourselves why, and that's what we do.
Okay, and to follow up on that question, you actually mentioned in your last answer that, this is today an almost exclusively male-driven organization, but women in the MS-13 have actually gotten relatively little attention. But you have a really interesting character in your book who's named Alma, who's a woman who is connected to the MS-13. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her and the role that women have or have had in the MS-13.
Yeah, Alma is a really a tragic story in a lot of ways, and again, kind of typical. I mean, talk about looking for a protective cocoon. I mean, this was definitely her reason for searching out the gang. She faced a lot of abuse in her home in El Salvador from her parents over the years, and then she was raped by her step grandfather. And after that rape, really her whole life changed dramatically, including things like, her carrying a knife, out of the house whenever she left the house. I mean, she would do that, basically does that to this day. And so she sought out this kind of surrogate family, or what she thought of as a surrogate family. And they immediately, and this was in El Salvador, and they immediately tasked her to a number of things, including gathering intelligence and beginning to collect extortion. This is a pretty typical job that women would get in gangs. They don't trust them to be high level assassins, for instance. They think they're just too weak. And in general terms, perhaps the strongest reason that they give anyway for not including women anymore is that they think that they become snitches or government informants much easier than men. There's no reason to believe that, but that's what they believe. So they give them these jobs that are slightly lower level jobs, running errands or stashing weapons or collecting extortion. And that's what Alma was doing. One of the people that she extorts at their behest is her godmother. And the reason that they extort her is because they have information from Alma. She becomes an informant of sorts about the amount of money that she's getting from her relatives who are living in the United States. The irony, of course, in Alma's case is that Alma runs afoul of the gang, as most gang members do. There's so much violence around the gang. And a lot of that violence is directed at their own members. And Alma is part of that trend. And in order to escape her dilemma with the gang, her family has to go to her godmother, who she's extorted for the gang, to get contact to the coyote that then gets her out of the country and to safety. So it's one of these, tragic stories that you just can't make these things up. And then she goes to the US, and I think it goes back to the earlier question you had, Professor Arias, which is, how do these gangs operate in our image of them? And she really surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, she runs in the gang circles again once she's in Virginia. And maybe that's not surprising because again, her family at that point is living in 1,500 miles, different places. She's living with her sister. She has all this trauma that's unprocessed, and she gets involved with the gang again. But it's kind of one of these relationships that we don't think of as a relationship you can have with the gang. She gets involved with the gang when she wants to, and she takes a step back when she doesn't want to. She can kind of pick and choose her moments. Um, and again, that's not typical for what we think of with gangs, but that's kind of how they are in the US. It's a very chaotic organization. It's not like a super sophisticated intelligence, counterintelligence operation that has, a sort of ability to track every single person everywhere they go and all the rest. That's not how it works. It's very haphazard, kind of chaotic existence. And she gets involved in stupid things, that they do. You drink too much, you smoke too much, and very violent activities. She attacks people that she perceives are attacking her or that are taking away, her resources. In her case, it's her girlfriend, and then she has a run-in, and then she gets deported back to El Salvador. So you can see these cycles over and over again. But what you can't see is a way out for her, and that's maybe the real key for this. You don't see where the escape hatch is at any point.
Mhm. So the next question I wanted to ask you is sort of about your experience and your process with this. Why did you decide to write a book about the MS-13, and what were the biggest challenges in writing this book?
Um, I didn't go into this thinking I was going to write. I started researching the MS-13. It was because as an organization at Insight Crime, we were trying to figure out how best to cover the region. And my partner and I, we kind of, maybe like masters of the universe, white guy style, we decided, oh, you cover South America and I'll cover, Central America and Mexico. It was kind of like that, so I ended up covering, or at least managing, our coverage of Central America and Mexico. And that was 10 years ago. So I started looking, obviously you have to look at the gangs. And I started looking at the gangs and certainly came at it from this very law enforcement optic. And I guess over time, researching it both for Insight Crime, and then later we did a National Institute of Justice project at Insight Crime in conjunction with American University. Over time, I began to see the gang in a different way. I didn't see them in strictly criminal terms. And part of that was related to all the different people that I was meeting in the gang. And part of that was just looking at, how the gang operates or doesn't. These constant, references to the gang as, something akin to Yakuza or the Zetas, made by our own government in some instances. In that case, the Treasury Department in 2012, when they designated this, a large criminal threat, and compared it literally with these super sophisticated, strong, criminal groups that I don't think fit in the same category. So in part, it was kind of like, okay, we want to tell a sort of human story about this. But I also want to tell a larger story about what the gang is, try and give a better description, more accurate description of what the gang is, how it works, how it interacts, with all of its different environments. And that includes also how it interacts and fights off other criminal organizations, and, especially the 18th Street, the general movement, migration of these, what is we sometimes call, maybe erroneously call, criminal migration, because we call it criminal migration because we're talking about the movement of criminal groups from, one country to another. But very often these guys are moving for all the same reasons that everybody else is moving. They have family, they have economic opportunity, or they're fleeing the gang. That was the thing that was also, very enlightening along the way, is how much violence you see is perpetrated by the gang on its own members, all of these different things. So it was an effort to kind of maybe demystify the gang on every level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what were your biggest challenges doing that?
It's a good question. I suppose the biggest challenge is that you can't just pick and choose who your characters are. You know, I can it's not like I, can say, I had an array of like, 35 gang members and I could select, the perfect representation of what their story is. So, that's kind of inherently built into any project like this. Access is difficult, I guess, is what I'm saying. And access to personal stories about MS-13 members is very difficult because they have a lot of restrictions about what they can talk about. And the gang is very vengeful. And the gang, especially if you appear in public and you are declared a snitch, you can be what's called green lit, and that can follow you around for life. So getting access and getting people to tell you their personal stories is very difficult. Then once, of course, you have those stories, then you have to go through a long process of corroborating those stories. And that involves talking with their relatives, talking with people who investigated them, going through all the public files that exist about their cases, because you can't simply accept what they tell you because they told you it. It could be a very compelling story. And in all cases in the book, I try and make clear, where I am more secure about the information or where the information is coming from. And at the end of the book, I have a very lengthy notes section that goes through each chapter's, the process of putting together each chapter. And I'll give you other resources you can go after and whatever. So I tried to be as transparent as possible where the sort of strength of the information, where the information is strong and where it might be not as strong. So, I think that's part of the process, especially for those of us who do research on criminal organizations, is to be transparent. I think there's a lot of kind of all-knowing writers, that they know. I don't like that. That's not my style. I try and be transparent with the reader about these shortfalls that I have, and I think every other researcher in these topics has.
So I wanted to remind the audience, now that it's a little after 1:45, that we're going to begin asking Mr. Dudley questions from you in just a few minutes. So if you'd like to ask any questions, please post them to the chat box. I wanted to ask you, given that you think that one of the principal things for understanding the MS-13 and responses to MS-13 is understanding the MS-13 as a social problem, how does your analysis, your interpretation of this organization, how could it inform policy responses, and how would the policy responses that you might seek to develop be different from what the Trump administration has developed?
Well, I think if we think about this as a social issue rather than just a law and order issue, then we probably the most important thing is we bring more people to the table, and we think about this in a broader manner. What I mean by that is that when we think about the depletion of resources that used to go to, let's say, English as a second language programs. We don't think about them just in terms of, oh, we don't have enough money and, we certainly can't pay for that when we can't pay for textbooks and those sorts of, we think about like those sorts of decisions of removing programs that are specifically designed for populations that are trying to integrate into our society might have the kind of ripple effects that, that lead to gangs, that lead to, people leaving school or never being integrated into school. A lot of the characters that I deal with are brought into the school system, for instance, and are facing, a huge amount of bullying. And there's one character that I follow. His name is he's pretty well-known guy in Los Angeles. His name is Alex Sanchez. And Alex is 2 years older than his brother Oscar, and they come at the same time. They're, I think it was 7 and 5 when they arrive in the U.S. And their differences of when they get here are very important in terms of their language ability. So Oscar picks up the language much quicker than Alex, who's the older one, and they have different problems in school. Oscar's problems are not related to his ability to sort of communicate in English. He picks it up very quick, but Alex's are. And Alex is sort of isolated from kind of the core groups in a way because he feels like he's never going to integrate himself. You know, Alex ends up, you know, being quite a strong, you know, personality himself, and you know, feels kind of bullied, and then he becomes the bully, etc. And he ends up joining the gang and being a member of a gang for many, many years. But where does that process start? You know, that process starts inside of our institutions that we are making decisions about. And we need to be very cognizant of that. That this is a social issue, and there's social issues that run across the gamut, and they have to do with access to good schools, ability to integrate people into communities, access to economic opportunities, whether or not you're documented or undocumented. Are there paths out of that, or do you have to, you know, operate in that manner for your whole life? That's sort of one aspect of it, right? There's other aspects of it that are, you know, 20 or 30-year processes. You know, if I were the one managing the budget, you asked me what I would do differently. I mean, just irrespective of being Trump or not, which I don't even want to think about. But if I were the, you know, person managing the budget, I would be looking at early family intervention. You know, one of the through lines of all of the experiences of these gang members is that they were abused. You know, they were physically or sexually abused. We are not putting sufficient resources towards dealing with those kind of questions in our society, and especially in those marginalized, absolutely hidden communities that we have operating, you know, completely off. They just, you know, pushed through a census, you know, before it was, you know, the court said, you know, stop taking the census. So you're going to lose a whole nother part of the population. I think those things, in my mind, all of those things have reverberations that lead people to fall through our very weak social safety nets and into the hands of gangs. So I would be addressing this in a much more holistic fashion. The way we do address it is largely a law enforcement approach. It's basically defined as a law enforcement approach. And part of that has to do with the way that we define gangs to begin with. The California state legislature, when they're developing the first laws against gangs, they basically copy and pasted the United Nations definition of organized crime for gangs. Now, gangs are not organized crime. And if we think of them that way, we're not going to be able to deal with them. So I think that all of this is related. Of course, I don't have the solutions. And what I'm talking about is mitigating the influence of gangs, not eliminating gangs, because that would be very difficult. But I think we need to look at this with a much wider lens.
Mm-hmm. So Alicia Ing in our audience asks, how much has MS-13 infiltrated the ranks of governments? You say they're not known for drug trafficking, but do they have the same influence as the narcos in Mexico?
The drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, just to start there, and I'm sure Professor Arias can jump in on this as well, are organizations that have worked with the highest echelons of the military, the police, and the political establishment in that country over a period of decades. And part of their business model is reliant on their interaction with those very high echelons of government. In other words, they're not able to move the amount of drugs that they are through Mexico and beyond if they do not have those relationships. The gangs are at a completely different level as it relates to those relationships. They don't have a sort of systematic relationship with the military, the police, and politicians in the way that these drug trafficking organizations do. Having said that, there are individual relationships that exist. There are parts of the police in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, that have interacted and still regularly interact with parts of these gangs, not just the MS-13. And I'll give you an example. Probably the most prominent of the examples is their ability to operate from the prison system inside of El Salvador. That is based on a prolonged and established relationship that they have with the guards and with the prison authorities inside and outside of those prisons. They're not able to do that unless they are able to sort of, I would say in this case, more sort of bribe and cajole those particular authorities to bend over for their wishes, which include things like getting things like contraband and being able to sell those things, getting things like telephones so they're able to communicate, or telephone chargers, or both, so they're able to communicate on the inside and the outside with their members, those sorts of things. So there's that. That's probably one of the most prominent interactions that you'll have with gangs and authorities across the board. And then there are very specific instances in which we have chronicled their interactions with high-level politicians. That has been an evolution, and in particular in one country, which is El Salvador. This is not a general thing. These conversations have mostly centered around the political parties' need to campaign in the areas that the gangs operate in. In other words, the gangs have a kind of territorial presence that's so strong that they can prohibit certain campaigns or politicians from coming into their neighborhoods, or they can allow you to come into their neighborhoods. So the interactions are mostly revolving around those efforts to campaign. And those, of course, lead to other interactions and other types of possible quid pro quos, which may include payment of money for access to those areas, establishment of programs like social programs, which would be under the aegis of the gangs in those neighborhoods, access and control of government resources during COVID in the areas under their control. So the government is handing out certain goods and services, and the gang is the one that takes those goods and distributes those goods. So we're seeing more and more of that, but it's not near at the level that we see in the case of Mexico. Professor Arias, I'm going to jump in there.
So, well, we actually have a question from someone else in the audience,
Okay.
which is related to this. So Douglas Medina asks, can you discuss the political dynamic between the MS-13 and politics in El Salvador, particularly the presidency, and the way in which US aid in El Salvador is implicated in these dynamics? In particular, the US sending El Salvador aid for crime prevention, and the relationship between that and peace negotiations among gangs in El Salvador.
Yeah, lots of layers to unpack there. I think layer one is kind of understanding the way that the gangs have evolved in that regard. And that again starts in the prison system. One of the things that prison gangs understand very well is the hierarchy of needs inside the prisons. And that has to do with physical protection, but it also has to do with sort of conditions inside the prisons. And gangs like the MS-13, and in this case, the 18th Street, their eternal rival inside the prison system in El Salvador, one of the things they did in the 2000s is they made that a sort of political stance of theirs, create better conditions inside the prisons. That gave them kind of an in with organizations outside of prisons that were already working to improve conditions inside of prisons. So they began to interact with NGOs and politicians who are also using this, this sort of what becomes, I know it's kind of hard for us to understand because it's not a wedge issue in the United States, but it is kind of a wedge issue. Prisons and management of prisons is a big issue in a place like El Salvador. So this becomes an important thing. And so they begin to interact also with politicians. All of this, again, starts with their control of the prisons. They begin to expand that out and use other forms of leverage beyond their ability to really disrupt what's happening inside the prison. And their most important point of leverage in that regard is the fluctuation of homicide rates. Homicide rates have become our proxy of evaluating countries in many regards. This is a very bad thing, and I think at Inside Crime, we've probably contributed to this. And so we need to do a little mea culpa on that. But let's leave that aside for a second and just understand that that is a huge thing, homicide rates. We look at homicide rate and we have an immediate evaluation of that country's ability to deal with crime and governance and foreign direct investment and all of these other sort of repercussions that this can have, right? The gang begins to understand that and they use that. And they decide we're going to lower the homicide rates if you give us certain things. And that's where kind of where the first gang, what was called the gang truce, begins in 2012. This was moving major leaders outside of the maximum security prisons so they could move to medium security prisons and reestablish their command and control over their own gang forces inside of El Salvador and perhaps even beyond. That was, let's say, short-lived, more or less 18 months that lasted, we could say. That kind of détente that existed between the two gangs, really in the service of their gang leaders to reestablish control, and brokered by the government, even though they didn't admit it. They tried to keep themselves at a distance. That led to more regular interactions, however, between the gangs and political parties, in particular around the 2014 presidential campaign, in which there were, and at Inside Crime, we chronicled one of these particular meetings, but there were meetings between the big traditional political parties and these gangs and these gang leaders. And that's where the swapping that I talked about earlier was going on, the swapping of helping political campaigns or hurting rival political campaigns in return for cash, in return for access to, government programs, those sorts of things. These interactions that were happening now at a national level had long been happening on a municipal level. I think we should point out, because mayors in particular understand the reality of their municipalities and have to deal with these realities on a much more visceral way than the national politicians do. So those interactions were really happening simultaneously on a municipal level for a long time. And one of those who was behind some of those municipal interactions is the current President Bukele. President Bukele was the mayor of San Salvador. And while he was the mayor of the municipality of San Salvador, which isn't just the city, but the municipality, there were these exchanges going on because he was trying to achieve certain things in terms of urban development projects in gang-controlled areas. So he needed to have these interactions. He himself didn't. He had interlocutors, of course. But this process of his own negotiations on a San Salvador level have now expanded to a national level now that he is president. He is spending a lot of time and political capital denying this. He, of course, is vilifying those of us who are reporting this. But this is our understanding from speaking to dozens of sources about the way in which this is working, and not just ours, but also other investigators and reporters on the ground in El Salvador who are also speaking to dozens of sources and citing documents about this. So this is where we are now. What this means is hard to say. Of course, I am not inherently against trying to deal with gangs in more creative ways. Like I was saying earlier, let's widen the table and make the table bigger so more actors can sit around any sort of table that is negotiating with gangs, let's say negotiating in quotation marks. So I inherently am not against it, but what I am against is that this is not a transparent process and seems to be only favoring his political party, because part of the arrangement he has is to open up space for him and his party to campaign and close up space for the rival parties to campaign. And this is very important because he wants to control congressional elections in February. And if he can control that, then perhaps he can even change the Constitution and stay in power as president for a much longer period of time. So you're starting to get the understanding of how the repercussions that this could have over the long term. But it's just an inkling because, of course, we don't know he's going to change the Constitution. We just think that, that's sort of his ultimate aim. And if the gangs can get him closer to that, well, it looks like the gangs might be willing to help him do that.
Mhm. Thank you. Lucina Chavez Rosique asks, the idea of social versus criminal strategies, social versus anti-crime strategies to address gangs would require substantial financial support. A lot of these activities in the US tend to be funded, tend to occur at private organizations with government contracts. And she offers the example of, say, the University Settlement House in New York. So in New York, there are networks of different NGOs that actually go and implement early intervention programs and support for at-risk youth programs in the city. It's often not done by the city or the state. It's done by local community service organizations.
Sure.
So without reinventing the wheel, she asks, the merging of how would you go about merging social services and community partnerships? And where do we start? Legislation, awareness raising, foreign affairs. And in particular, I guess this question on one level addresses New York, but I guess it also sort of points us in the direction of how this applies in a place like El Salvador, where gang leaders are purchasing bus companies, right? Where they're, sort of is an infinite capacity for them under those circumstances to raise money and become, entrenched in robust urban markets.
I should preface everything that, first of all, the book is not, I am not giving you policy prescriptions in the book,
Mhm.
and I am not, this isn't my world necessarily either. So I preface everything I'm saying by saying my interactions with people who do this is where I'm getting any kind of, response to these sorts of things. It's a very complex and the right question. I think that these are the right questions, because these things are overlapping, and it does have to be a private-public partnership that we're talking about. The most successful and robust gang intervention projects are just that. They are this public-private interaction that is a combination of pulling together of government resources with community and social capital, or organizations that have a lot of social capital, the church, for instance, or organizations that are affiliated with churches in the case of El Salvador. But not just that, the case of, I mentioned Alex Sanchez, he works with an organization that doesn't have any religious affiliation, and he largely shuns that, but he receives loads of government funding. And that's a tertiary prevention program where he's working with admitted gang members or people who've been convicted for gang related offenses, those sorts of things. So those kind of partnerships are definitely crucial. I don't know what the order of things in terms of legislation and those sorts of. What I would argue, though, is that that we first have to start thinking about these things in a much different way. That this is not simply a law and order issue, and that's kind of the hardest thing to get across. The amount of resources put towards law enforcement efforts that seem to sort of just keep us on this hamster wheel is just vastly superior than the amount of resources in these other areas, which are much harder, much less politically palatable, but I would argue much more important over the long haul. And they include things like tertiary prevention strategies, cognitive behavioral therapy strategies, early family interventions, beefing up after school programs, all of these ways to create what I would say are alternative communities, kind of catch basins for these kids that end up falling into, these gang structures, and they fall into them for a lot of reasons. And we have to understand those reasons and maybe not replicate it exactly, but certainly understand why things such as the evangelical church is one of the only accepted avenues for escape, or for retiring permanently from a gang. So there are several ways you can leave a gang, and one of them is just flee. Another is to become a calmado, as referring to earlier, kind of a retired, which means you don't really leave. You're just calmado. You're just getting older. You have a family, you have a job. You just say, just leave me alone. And largely they leave you alone. This is how most guys leave a gang. Or you ask for permission, and you can go through something like the evangelical church. But why is that? Why is it acceptable to go to the evangelical church? What does the evangelical church community have that we could figure out how to replicate on a mass scale, and hopefully become a kind of community that is acceptable to leave and operate in? Because I think that's what I feel like what you're doing when you compete against gangs is you have to create a protective alternative community. Otherwise, it's just going to continue.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask a question about a little bit about Barrio 18, right? What are the similarities and differences between MS-13 and Barrio 18?
They both come from the same place. They both were born in central LA, a few blocks from each other, actually. The Barrio 18, or what's just called 18th Street there, was born on 18th in Arapahoe in the city center there. And they were born in the 60s. So very different time period in which the MS-13 was born, which is the 80s. They're much more linked in their original ethos to the kind of Mexican-American gang tradition. Much more kind of, classic kind of zoot suit cholo style, and certainly draw from a lot of the traditions of Mexican-American gangs in LA. And they have a lot of members who are Mexican-Americans, obviously. They at one point, allowed for, this is the 18th Street, allowed for a lot of different nationalities, and then it kind of honed down to kind of Latinos only. The MS-13, on the other hand, was always, it very much clung to its Salvadoran identity. Its origin story is a sort of Salvadoran group, originally, obviously, as metalheads. They thought of themselves as kind of rebels in that sense. That's part of them embracing, this heavy metal music and whatnot. We're revolutionary of sorts. And for a while they got along. They occupied the same spaces. There's certainly some research that suggests that their members could even move somewhat fluidly between the two gangs. You could be in one gang and then the other. But over time, as other research has shown, they began to butt up against one another. For reasons that have less to do with their differences, because they really began to evolve in a very similar way in terms of their membership. The MS-13 began to sort of take on more the sort of rules and traditions and rituals of the Mexican-American gangs. So that became very similar. Their criminal economies were very similar. So they were involved in, very low-level extortion, drug peddling, and things of that sort. Eventually, they both became under the larger umbrella of the Mexican mafia, which is called the Sureños. So they were part of that. So they had a lot of shared experiences. They're really kind of mirror images of one another in a lot of ways. The difference in the US is that the 18th Street is older and much larger. It's 5 times the size of the MS-13 in the United States. But you never hear them, they're never mentioned on a high level political platform. But in other spaces such as El Salvador, the MS-13 is larger, double or maybe even triple the size of its 18th Street counterparts in places like El Salvador. So, you have those kind of differences, but they went through a lot of the same machinations, mass incarceration, then ex-convicts, then deported back to these areas, formation of their gang counterparts under these brand names, big brand names, and their fight, which began, the legend of the fight is it started in a party in Los Angeles, and in the late 1980s, and literally that fight has come to define them in a lot of ways. Both of them, they thrive off of having that rival. They thrive from, you're a street gang for a lot of reasons, and one of them is because you have a rival. So that is a very important thing to their sort of core ethos, is having this rivalry, and it certainly has influenced their development. Their kind of reason for taking over territory is often more about, or just as much about, fighting off 18th Street as it is, spreading their, potential targets for extortion, for instance. So it becomes a kind of reason for being in and of itself, and kind of is infused into their core ethos. They have rules about the 18th Street. You run into an 18th Street guy on the street, you have to confront them. That's just, if you don't, you could face very severe repercussions. But of course, that has huge reverberations too for the gang. So that is, at the end of the day, they're similar. There's certainly arguments that the MS-13 is more sophisticated in some regards. It's hard to kind of prove any of that empirically, so I kind of stay away from that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the last question I wanted to ask you is, how do you see the MS-13 evolving in the future? What do you see as the coming trends for the MS-13?
I don't see them evolving in any rapid fashion. I think that they're largely going to exist as they have existed for the last, 30 years. The MS-13, I guess, and maybe this is one of the most important things to take away, is not one single unit. It's a hodgepodge of different, criminal or social/criminal groups that is all over the region. And there are different activities they're involved in different places, different levels of sophistication, different levels of action with politicians, as we saw, or not, different levels of violence. All of this is happening simultaneously because there is no MS-13. There are literally dozens of MS-13. So it's not one single unit. So I don't see it evolving as one single unit. I see that there may be some parts of it that may become, an international drug trafficking organization. Maybe, and the clearest indication of this is in Honduras, where they've gone from drug peddlers to controlling wholesale markets to possibly controlling trafficking corridors and this is the important part, being the ones responsible for moving the drugs. And in other words, they are the ones who are not just controlling the physical space to collect some form of quota from those who are doing the drug trafficking, but they themselves are doing the drug trafficking. So this would be a significant step up and would indicate to us that maybe they're reaching that status. But as I mentioned before, they always fail in these efforts, the ones. And again, they are individual cliques. This is not a gang-wide project. This isn't this clique dragging the rest of the gang to become this giant overarching, Sinaloa cartel operation. That's not how this works. They're all kind of doing their own thing in these individual geographic spaces, occasionally crossing these borders and having these interactions. So that's how they're going to continue to operate, in my mind, in these own specific bespoke areas, which again, it was what makes them so resilient and so difficult to deal with. It's not just one single organism.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time. Really appreciated your contributions today. Learned a great deal. And I hope that next time we see each other, we'll be able to see each other in person.
Thank you again, Professor Arias, and thanks again to Baruch College. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a good afternoon.